So my name is Brennan Smith. I am a graduate assistant with Health and Wellness. I'm a first-year graduate student in biomechanics, and today I'm going to be discussing how to transform your inner critic. So clearly you're not alone. Everyone has this inner critic, as evidenced by the 178 people who have signed up for this presentation. So that's kind of the bottom line, where it's a normal thing and you're not alone in it. So what we're going to be going over in this presentation is a breakdown of this inner critic, what it is, when it shows up, why it's there, how did it get there in the first place, and the implication of the inner critic. And then we're going to go into the practical portion and discuss how to transform the inner critic through some mechanisms of awareness, identification, personalization, empathizing, and some action steps that you can take to kind of address that inner critic. So let's start with what the inner critic actually is. So the inner critic can manifest itself in a couple different ways. It's pretty flexible. Obviously, everyone is different, so it can show up in different ways in your life. One way it shows up is with specific thoughts, and I'm sure everyone knows what these thoughts are. They're usually definitive, so either always, never, I am, like defining the terms. Like I always mess this up, or I can never do this, or I'm blank, verb, or not verb, adjective, yeah. Or it can manifest itself into your subconscious. So you may not be aware specifically of these thoughts that you have in your head, but it will kind of integrate itself into the way that you go about life. So how you operate in life. This can travel into different areas of your life, such as your circle of friends or who you surround yourself with. You may surround yourself with more critical people or people who treat you poorly and you just accept it just because you don't think that there's anything better for you. Or it can manifest itself into your career, or if you're in school or whatever you are there, to where you don't work as hard because you don't think it's going to be good enough anyway. It can cause you to not go for what you really want in your life because you're telling yourself basically that you can't do it anyway because of that negative inner critic. So it can be kind of a self-sabotage aspect in your life that can be overcome, so it's okay. This inner critic shows up mostly when you're vulnerable or you're going after something that you truly want in your life. So when you're stepping out of your comfort zone to go for that promotion you want, or when you're trying to switch careers, or when you're trying to make new friends, or really anything that you are not comfortable with. And so it's really around your deepest desires. And as we're going to address a little bit later, it's for a purpose that our inner critic does this as a way to kind of the fear of rejection, maybe the fear of the unknown, the fear of being criticized by people. So we'll address that in our next slide here. The inner critic actually has a function. It's not something that we just want to cut out completely, because it actually is there to protect us from emotional vulnerability and harm. So if you think about, you're out in the wild for some reason, you see a bear. Your sympathetic system is going to tell you to run away from the bear because it's probably going to maul you if you don't run away from it. And it's the same way with the inner critic. Acts as our emotional protector, just like the fight or flight response in our sympathetic system. Basically, the inner critic is telling us, be careful, you might be hurt. It's a normal thing. I want to protect you from being vulnerable and getting mauled by these potential critics and rejections. So it definitely has a purpose. We just have to learn to address it and use the inner critic as a learning tool to dig within ourselves and our thoughts. So the inner critic can develop obviously through early development, but also in your adult life. So during early life, not necessarily just as a kid, but also growing up as a young adult, it can be developed mostly by negative circumstances, obviously, but being surrounded by people who either directly or indirectly tell you that you're not good enough, or just directly or indirectly tell you negative things about yourself or about your situation. An example that I was reading in a study was about children who are abandoned oftentimes think that something is wrong with them because they grew up without anyone wanting them. So they tend to develop lower self-worth and self-esteem just because of their development in early life. Excuse me, sorry. So another theory, which I thought was interesting, is that criticism or guilt-induced comments will motivate behavior. Basically, this idea is that if you tell yourself that you're not good enough or tell yourself negative comments, you'll be inspired to change. So this kind of negative comment to induce your behavior actually sends you into a spiral of paralyzing fear and just reinforcing the negative thoughts that you have about yourself. Kind of tying into that, like I said, it kind of sends you into kind of paralyzing fear of criticism. Fear of criticism, fear of rejection, fear that people won't like you or accept you for who you are. It also triggers a sense of avoidance. So this part was very, very interesting to me because some of the behaviors that the research shows aren't typically what you would think of like self-esteem issues. So obviously, if you're feeling like you're not good enough, you're going to avoid those sources of criticism, such as the people that are criticizing you, the places that you feel most criticized, activities that you might have enjoyed before that someone maybe criticized you there, and now you're like, oh, I can't walk on that treadmill now because someone told me that it wasn't good enough. And then another one is actually avoiding yourself. So I also related really highly to this one because I tend to keep myself busy so that I don't stay in my own head too long, because that's when I hear my negative critic the most. And so I feel like a lot of people can relate with that. You keep yourself busy so you don't have to actually think about the issues that you might have that are kind of at the forefront of your mind. Procrastination, actually, definitely relate with that one too in school, because you don't think that what you're going to do is good enough. You put it off, and you just put not your best effort forward because in your mind you're already accepting that it's not going to be good enough, so why even try? And then it can lead to other addictive behaviors such as overeating, emotional eating, such as like eating when you're not hungry, just grazing throughout the day on not necessarily healthy things, smoking, drinking, constantly checking your phone or your Facebook or other social media to see notifications to kind of boost that self-esteem, and excessive TV. And that kind of goes back to the avoiding being alone with yourself. You're distracting yourself with all of these external sources to kind of have a mindless experience to avoid thinking about, I guess, your issues. They're not really issues, it's normal. Then this critic can also lead to a sense of shame, which kind of goes around with all of these other points. Because you don't feel like you're good enough, you don't want to connect with people because you're thinking, well, I'm not good enough anyway, they're not going to like me anyway, so I might as well not try to connect with people. And it leads to a sense of isolation, and the sense of isolation further leads into aloneness and a learning how to be alone, and that aloneness is normal for you. So just so you know, we are made to be connected with other people, and the research shows that isolation leads to a greater incidence of depression and social anxiety. So obviously this strong inner critic can lead to an incidence of other mental health disorders. But again, It can be fixed. We can learn to address it. Another interesting thing about this strong inner critic is that this negative thinking repeated over time can lead to an anticipation in social anxiety, obsessive thoughts in OCD, intrusive thoughts in PTSD, and cognitions in panic disorder. It also maintains depression, like I said before. The more negative thoughts you let into your head just roll around all the time, the more it just allows depression to stay there, and you just kind of wallow there. And then in a physiological sense, the negative ruminating thoughts can also lead to an increased stress response from cortisol. And cortisol is actually a physiological mechanism to increase your heart rate, increase your blood pressure, to outrun that bear that I was talking about earlier. So it's preparing you to have a flight response. And so it can lead to negative effects on your body if it's a chronic issue. So that's what I thought was very interesting, that even just a negative thought can increase your cortisol, not only during the stress, but after the stress is over. So how are we going to deal with this? This is the practical portion and the hopeful portion here. So the first step is to be aware and recognize your own thoughts. So first of all, I just want to make this clear. Just because you think something doesn't mean it is the absolute truth. So just because you think, okay, I'm really ugly, there's no way that that's not true, so it must be true. That's illogical thinking. So I definitely have been caught in that before, because I'm a very logical and rational person. And I'm like, okay, I'm a smart person. If I think this, it must be true. Not necessarily, okay? Also, this inner critic is not necessarily your own voice, which we'll address in a couple slides, and that the knowledge that it is not your own voice helps to kind of separate these voices from who you actually are. So being aware of your thought processes is another really good method to start becoming aware of this inner voice. Some kind of negative processes that could help feed this negative voice are all or nothing thinking. So another thought process is catastrophizing. So this is basically making the worst out of a situation. So say your coworker comes in to work and they're a little bit grumpy. You think, oh, they hate me because they're grumpy today and they're not interacting with me as they normally would. Catastrophizing, you're just heightening that response. You immediately go to, they hate me, instead of, they probably just had a bad morning. Maybe they got a flat tire. Maybe they got into a fight. I don't really know. But catastrophizing is just going straight to that negative thing. Emotional reasoning is another thing where you're thinking, well, my emotions are telling me this. So despite the evidence against these emotions, I'm going to go with this reasoning here instead of a logical explanation. That could, again, relate to that coworker. Instead of thinking maybe they just had a rough morning, you just go with your emotions with, they just hate me today. Personalization, same thing, basically projecting your own negative feelings about yourself onto others. That coworker again. My coworker thinks I'm annoying because I talk too much. My coworker thinks that I'm dumb because I said this wrong in class today, or in work today, or my classmates think I'm dumb because I answered the wrong question. Not necessarily true. You don't know what other people are thinking. Okay. Second step, identifying your inner critic. I made it kind of easy for the who, what, when, where, and why questions. So that way, when you're in the midst of this inner critic kind of bombarding you with things, you don't have to think of all these complex, like, phrases in order to help yourself. So 1, whose voice am I hearing? 2, what are they saying? That is probably one of the most key things, identifying what exactly they're saying. When do I hear my inner critic the most? Like I said, areas of vulnerability, areas of stress, things that you actually care about. Where did my inner critic originate? This is also another one that's pretty big. It helps to separate yourself from the past because you're not defined, and you're present. You are who you are right now. And why are these negative thoughts popping up? What circumstance is happening in my life that is causing me to think like this? And like I said, it could be stress, could be areas of vulnerability. Like we addressed earlier, it's usually the key phrases, definitive terms, just negative thoughts about yourself and about your personality. So picturing your inner critic. So giving your critic a face or a body or its own little personality, it makes it easier to address the inner critic directly instead of letting it just get lost in your own mind. So you can also disassociate with yourself with the critic if you put a face to it. So for example, my inner critic, I imagine it to be myself in middle school because I wore headgear and braces at the same time. Who made that okay? I don't know. And I was really awkward and didn't have many friends. So I just thought of myself as this lowly little middle schooler who had not a lot to offer in the world. So I can see my inner critic as that child. And it's easy for me to be compassionate to that child and to disassociate myself with it when I imagine it as myself as a middle schooler. Imagining what it looks like is a really great tool to start to almost embrace that negative critic and transform it to be a beneficial part of your life. From there, to be a beneficial part of your life, the inner critic, to be beneficial, you start to empathize it. Like I said, if you imagine it as your little middle school self, you have compassion on it. Because for me, I've been there, so I can see back in the past, like, it's okay, you can do it. You're not going to be a mess up in your future life. You're going to be in grad school. It's okay. Don't worry about it. You can empathize with it, have compassion on it, and start to think what it's actually trying to protect you from, because it does have a purpose. Like we addressed earlier, it's to protect you. And so you can start asking it the question, what are you trying to protect me from? And so you can identify what it's trying to do for you, and identifying what the critic is afraid of if it doesn't do its job in warning you about the situation. So an example would be like, okay, I'm working on a project. My inner critic is like, ooh, I don't know if that's going to be good enough. You better just stop right now. The critic is trying to protect me from being potentially rejected by people and criticized. So when you put a face to this critic, you can go ahead and say, I understand that you're scared. I'm going to have compassion on you because I understand that you're terrified right now. But thank you, but I got this. I'm not the same person that I was before. I've come a long way, and I can do this. So you can start having those positive thoughts and actually comfort your critic as if it was a separate entity of yourself, like a little child. A child is what comes to my mind when I think of the inner critic, just because it's associated with fear a lot of the time. So you can actually talk to your critic directly instead of just telling it to be quiet or to like go away, because that way you're not actually addressing it or comforting it at all. So a couple of things that you can put into action to start transforming this critic. Like I said, personalizing the critic is a really great tool. Like I said, you can start embracing it, addressing it, comforting it, and shaping it to be a beneficial tool to figure out what's going on in your life, instead of just being like, oh, I struggle with this inner critic all the time, that means I'm not good enough. You can use it actually to figure out what direction you want to go in your life, whatever it is. It could be work, it could be personal. It serves a purpose. So another really great thing is to practice positive thinking. So like I said, I'm a visual person, so I like to write things down and either put them on my mirror or put them on places that I frequent. I wrote a note to myself on a whiteboard in my kitchen, and I see it every single day, and it just reminds me to keep up that positive thinking and that I am good enough. Another really permanent solution, I got this tattoo like 2 months ago, to remind myself that I am enough and I am worthy. And obviously this is on my body, so I see it every single day, and it just serves as a purpose to remind myself that I am good enough, and that I'm lying to myself if ever I think, okay, well, I'm not good enough to be here, I'm not smart enough, etc. So that's a good reminder. Just notes in general, or speaking it out loud to yourself in the mirror. So speak your truths, no matter if you believe them or not. A lot of the times when I first started this, I didn't believe what I was saying to myself. I'm enough. I didn't believe it at all. But the more you say it, the more you actually believe it. And if you actually say it out loud to yourself in the mirror while looking yourself in the eyes, it resonates deeper in your brain just from a physiological standpoint. Stop letting your thoughts run amok or ruminating. That can lead into a really bad spiral of negative thoughts if you just let your emotions run around and replay in your mind. So again, converting to rational mind is a really good technique that I've learned personally. So if I'm going through a really tough time of anxiety or self-worth issues in my life, or just in a certain time period, I'll start to identify things. And that way you're converting from emotional mind to rational mind. You could even just count or do the ABCs or identify colors. But basically you're redirecting your thoughts from the emotional thoughts to logical and rational thoughts. And then another kind of thing with going to your rational mind is you're examining the evidence. So you write down a for column and an against column, and you write your thought at the top of the page, and you write all the evidence for whatever thought you're having and all the evidence against whatever thought you're having. And usually the against evidence is greater than the for evidence because it's emotional thinking. So that way you're kind of redirecting your thoughts into more of a logical process. Again, this kind of ties into the whole logical aspect. You can replace your thoughts with more accurate statements or the opposite of whatever thought you're having. So, for example, I'm not good enough for this. You can say, I'm a human, I screw up sometimes, I'm not defined by my mistakes, I'm just gonna try harder next time. Or I'm really, really messed up, I can never make it in life, what's wrong with me, can be translated back to, I'm a human, no one's perfect, look at how far I've come, I'm really proud of myself on my journey so far, and I have still a journey to go, I can do this. And then a gratefulness journal is really awesome too, because gratefulness breeds joy a lot of the time. So when you write down what you're thankful for in your life, you realize what you have. The next steps, since this is not a therapy session, this is just an educational, eye-opening presentation, you do have next steps to do. So you have resources. You could go through the Be Well program and do a Be Well consult with either Amy or Jackie, and it's absolutely free. With Amy, you would do either a phone call or a video chat. With Jackie, she's actually here on campus, and they can both help you work through your inner critic and start to transform that inner critic through practical things. You also have access to the work-life connections counseling by being a faculty or regular staff member. It's voluntary, confidential. You get 5 free sessions with a certified and licensed therapist. And I included the phone number on the slides if anyone wanted the resource there. Does anyone have any questions?
So this is Amy, health coach for UK Health and Wellness. And I don't have any specific resource for the research on athletes. But I do know a lot of the work that we do, both Jackie and I do with the inner critic is helping folks really transform that voice from critic to more of a coach. And so I think, oftentimes people think, well, I have to have the inner critic in order to excel. I have to have the inner critic in order to make my life better. And I think the difference is we want to think about the inner critic is really different than realistic thinking. Like the inner critic, doesn't actually have any interest in actual evidence. They're not, thinking about, the inner critic message is repetitive. They focus on problems, an area of lacking. They really speak in an anxious tone, versus realistic thinking is really more curious. A realistic thinking and coach thinking is really interested in gathering the evidence to inform conclusions and asks open-ended questions like, how might this be possible? How could I improve? Instead of that idea of, you're never going to improve. Or it's seeking solutions, and it speaks in a calmer tone. You're working with the critic when it's anxious and it's fear-based. And what research shows is that when we're stuck in that fear-based place, even though we think that fear drill sergeant is going to help us, it actually creates a shame spiral. So I think the idea is to recognize that voice, just as Brennan was saying, and seeing when we can transform it into something that's more realistic and into something that's actually going to serve us and help us create forward movement instead of a downward spiral shame fear place.
Questions on the right hand side of the arrow, so you can start to identify your own inner critic and start to transform that in a practical sense. And I'm not saying it's easy by any means, and it's definitely a process, but it's doable. You can do it. You have hope. It is awesome and it's great. Does anyone have any other questions?
So just as Brendan was saying, this really is a process. It's not like you can come to the presentation, take away these key queries and questions and be like, all right, inner critic, we're good to go. Let's roll it out. It really is the day-to-day working, recognizing, noticing, separating yourself, kind of the I voice from the inner critic voice. And so if you are starting to really wonder how you can do deeper work with the critic and how you can really transform some of those messages, because the inner critic, just like Brendan said, it's there to keep you safe. It's there to protect you. The kicker is it's doing it in a way that isn't serving you anymore. It's doing it in a way that really is harming you, getting closer to what you really want, and keeping you stuck. And so that's what Jackie and I do as coaches. We really help you go and help untangle some of these voices and help you get clear on turning that critic into a coach, turning that critical voice into something that actually is going to serve you and helping you practice in that way. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you'd like to do any of that deeper work. That's what we're here for, and we'd love to help you in any way that we can.
The next Lunch and Learn presentation is on February 22nd. It's going to be with Brian Morton, and he's going to be talking about weight training beyond the gym. So he's going to be talking about body weight stuff, mobility things,